Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Cruz wash processed Peru from Friedhats Coffee. And there's the bottle right there. And Friedhats, based out of Amsterdam, Netherlands. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel quite a bit over the years, and that is largely because they are one of the more accessible European coffee roasters in the United States, as I often see quite a few multi-roasters carrying their coffees. So when I found this one at a local coffee shop, it caught my interest for a number of reasons, first of which being that it is one of their wash processed offerings. In addition to that, it is one of their filter offerings. Next, it very much sounded like my type of coffee. And then the last reason being that our Friedhats reviews are actually pretty popular with you guys as well. So I figured we'd go ahead and pick this one up, and it'll be interesting to see how it turned out, as this right here is day 50? Day 50. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, as mentioned, this is one of their filter offerings, and when comparing it alongside the other filter offerings that we've reviewed from other Dutch-based coffee roasters, so thinking primarily of Manhattan or a Matter of Concrete, it's actually the lightest of the three based off recent experiences we've had from the other two coffee roasters, so it has been a bit since we've last reviewed anything from Manhattan. But in a more grand comparison, I do believe that Friedhats still roasts on a Probat, so a comparable coffee roaster might be somebody like Calendar, who I would say is probably still a little bit lighter than the experience that we did have from this filter offering. But that being said, this is one of the lighter filter offerings that we've had from Friedhats as well, so I feel like a lot of people would either say it's on the slightly lighter side of a medium light or maybe on the more developed side of a light, but still a little lighter in general in the grand scheme of things. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was nice, and that was the first takeaway that I did have from this coffee, was that it was just a slight bit lighter than some of the other Friedhat offerings that we've had in the past. And we mentioned in one of our more recent Friedhats reviews that I usually do look for their filter offerings, as I'm not the biggest fan of the Omni Roast profile that they do have, but I think I've noticed that their Omni Roast profile is usually reserved for either their more processed coffees or their higher end offerings as well. But I do like to stick to their filter offerings, as I think it's a nice profile for what it is. That's one of the main reasons I opted for this coffee. What was really nice though was it presented pretty well in the sugary senses. One of the main reasons I picked up this coffee as well was because of the profile or I guess the description that they had listed for this coffee. What do we have? Cane sugar, white peach, and dried apricot. I mean, all of those are notes that I do look for in a coffee. And with this one being a standard wash process Peruvian coffee, I was curious to see how it would play out if it would be one of those more traditional South American coffees with subtle traces of those other characteristics, or if those would be the more dominant qualities to it. And it did skew a little bit more on the traditional South American side of things with traces of these stone fruit characteristics, but they were abundant and intense enough to the point where I was actually quite pleased with the way that this coffee turned out on the first impression. So we'll go ahead and move on to day 19, as we opted for the Chemex, and it was another nice day for this coffee, as it does continue to offer a more sugary and stone fruit forward experience than expected. I think going into it, I did probably expect it was going to skew maybe a little bit more developed than it did, maybe a little bit more on the traditional side of things, so just a little bit more heavy-bodied, a little bit more subtle in the fruit presentation, but to my surprise, it did continue to turn out a lot more sweet and a lot more defined in those specific traits. Clean again with a slight herbality, giving it a fun peach soda-like feel, so first couple of impressions, pretty nice. Definitely one of the more positive impressions I've had of a Friedhats coffee overall. Day 22 through the UFO brewer, and the coffee does continue to perform well, as it's offering a very prominent level of sweetness, and I can't help but shake the fact that I was just very happy with the sweetness that this coffee did offer, very sugary and candy-like in that sense. Additionally, more of that peach soda feel, plenty of intensity, medium body to another nice day of this one, so essentially just all positives based off these first couple of tries. Day 25 through the V60 with Friedhats recipe, and Friedhats recipe is interesting to me because if I remember correctly, I think the bloom is at a significantly lower temperature, but essentially it equates to a 15-to-1 at 90 degrees Celsius, which is a very low extraction adjustment on this coffee, especially given how much success we had had beforehand. And it definitely backtracked as it felt significantly less intense than some of the earlier experiences, and the stone fruit quality was much more generic. This was much more faint, probably a lot closer to what I was expecting from this coffee, as it didn't have the same level of definition, toned down overall. So given I'd had a lot of positive experiences leading up to this point, and this one was much closer to what I was probably expecting for this coffee going into it, I definitely wanted to revert back when we got the opportunity. But we progress, as on day 28, we continued with the Chemex and the same adjustments, so Friedhats recipe again. And it's nice with a solid level of sweetness and sugary fruit qualities to it, but it's still a little less intense in that regard. So in addition to the fruit qualities in a more toned down sense, there's a little bit more of a brown candy characteristic that I would describe as being reminiscent of butterscotch. So this offered a little bit more depth. I was able to see a little bit more from this coffee. So a little bit more mixed overall, clean, balanced, so positives to take away regardless. Day 34, through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee was back to being at its best as it's offering a little bit more of a molasses-like sweetness. And this was the first appearance of that. We have quite a few Friedhats reviews on this channel, and I've mentioned that it's a pretty consistent characteristic that I do get with a lot of their coffees. And in the past, I've wondered if it's because of the bottles that they use, but now that I'm really thinking about it, I do wonder if it's the roaster that they use, because a lot of times these drum roasters can have a unique characteristic to them, and I'm beginning to wonder if maybe that's part of it. It could still also be the bottles. Regardless, more of the peach soda characteristics with that slight herbal quality to it, and still plenty of intensity, so back to being at its best, back to being the type of coffee I was enjoying. Day 37 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it has remained consistent throughout, with the exception of when we went really low on the extraction. I really don't think that helped this coffee whatsoever. Traditional base, plenty of peachy and sugary traits to it in a complementary sense. So while it is skewing in that more South American base profile, it is made up for with just how intense the fruit qualities are within this one. Day 44, final notes we have through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it continues to work well for this coffee as it really seems to accentuate the sugary fruit qualities to it, with the focus mainly being on the listed stone fruit characteristics outside of the traditionality. Some palm fruit brightness to it in a pear-like sense as well, with a secondary citrus reminiscent of orange and lemon. Also the classic Friedhats dark molasses and brown sugar quality with a little bit of honey as well. So a lot of depth, butterscotch as well. A lot of notes I can list for this coffee because it does have a very nice combination of fruit and traditional qualities to it. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see where we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. Let's go through them, starting with the cleanliness level 4. Very clean cup of coffee, and in terms of a lot of the coffees we've had from Friedhats, maybe the cleanest that we've had as of this moment. We don't review too many of their higher end offerings, but even in comparison to some of the Geshes, I was really pleased with the cleanliness that this coffee did offer. So level 4, where we opted to put that, really nice definition to the vast majority of characteristics within this one. Finish level 4. Very happy with the finish oftentimes when it comes to wash processed coffees that are roasted in a drum roaster. I'm still assuming that this one's roasted on a Probat, but regardless, it offered a lot of those drum roaster characteristics to it. Mentioned that dark molasses, brown sugar, butterscotch, all characteristics that I oftentimes associate with drum roasters. So I'm very pleased with that. Sweetness level 4, a lot of sweetness, mentioned all those characteristics, all presenting in a sweeter sense. But in addition to that, the fruit sweetness to this coffee is also very nice. So plenty of depth to the sweeter characteristics of this one. Citrus fruit level 4, that is a combination of things. I mentioned a number of the citric qualities to it, lemon and orange. And then in addition to that, there's that palm fruit brightness to this coffee, which while not necessarily the most abundant, it did, in terms of the brightness to it, the other qualities in the citric sense made up for it. So we did decide to put it up there at that level 4 mark, not as equal to the stone fruits, which we also have at a level 4, but close enough to the point where we left it there. Stone fruits level 4, that was my big thing going into this coffee. It is pretty sugary. It does offer plenty of the listed apricot characteristics to it. I can definitely see those. And the peach also is pretty well defined. I continue to go back to a peach soda characteristic, and I am very happy with that descriptor based off the way these stone fruits did present within this coffee. Go through the level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Not the brightest coffee. Did not expect it to be the brightest coffee. Still skewing a little bit more on the traditional side, but still enough of that palm fruit brightness to give it a little bit of depth. Kind of pear-like given the sugariness of this coffee as well. Florality level 3. Don't have too much to add to that. I can kind of see that honey floral characteristic to it, but not enough to the point where it was equal to the fruit qualities. 2 things left worth discussing. Caramel level 3. I mentioned a number of those robot-like characteristics to it, and that is the molasses, brown sugar, butterscotch-like quality, and that's pretty abundant level 3 where we opted to put that. Final thing worth discussing, body level 2. I think that's probably the biggest surprise when it came to this coffee, as I would expect it to have a little bit more texture to it. I can't remember what the varietal of this coffee is. I'll have to look that up afterwards, but regardless, it's not a geisha, and even then Peruvian geishas can have a little bit more body and texture to them, but level 2 where we opted to put that, just lighter bodied at the end of the day. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one's actually one of the more enjoyable Friedhats coffees that we have reviewed on this channel, and it's not really surprising. This is everything that I'm looking for when it comes to a Friedhats coffee. I went through that at the start of this review, and I think it translated well, especially in the stone fruit sense. It did exceed my expectations going into this coffee. Even with it having moderate expectations, I do think there's a ceiling to how much I can enjoy a coffee from Friedhats based off of their profile. But even then, when they execute it this well, then I'm just left very happy with the way that it did turn out. I mean, having a standard Peruvian coffee, this isn't even a geisha. It's not anything overly unique or out there. That speaks pretty strong to just how enjoyable and how well done this coffee was. So credit to Friedhats on this one. Credit to the producer on this one. Very enjoyable coffee throughout. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It does have that nice marriage of traditionality as well as unique fruit qualities that add to that traditional aspect to it. So it is very much a Peruvian coffee. You're not going to get this confused for an African coffee in the way that the fruits do present themselves. It may not necessarily have the same amount of texture, but it does make up for it with the other qualities to it. Not the brightest coffee, plenty of sweetness, plenty of that traditional brown sugar, molasses, kind of caramelized aspect to it. And then the fruits do present nicely as a complementary sense to it. So a lot of positives to take away from this one. Best direction I can point somebody towards on it as well. And the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Cruz Pata wash processed Peru from Friedhats Coffee. Thank you for watching.